and welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Harry De Cosmo, freelance football journalist for BBC Sport and others, and I'm back here after PSG in my office for the first time in a while, looking ahead to Newcastle against West Ham on Sunday, but also just still recovering from that crazy experience on Wednesday night at St James's Park. I still stand by what I said. I know there's been a lot of debate over the last couple of days. Where does that game stand in the pantheon of great games at St James's Park? For me, it's still top because of everything that you put into it. Newcastle playing against the best player in the world and Kylian Mbappe, keeping him quiet the way they did. The sort of narrative around the group plays into it as well. The team performance, the fact that everybody played a part, and the fact that it's the identity of the team was on show. And I think that's what's really crucial about this team, is that the identity goes ahead of the players, because there's a number of first team players that are out at the moment, and we'll get into ahead of West Ham on Sunday in a minute, but no Sven Botman on Wednesday, no Joe Linton, no Callum Wilson, and a number of other players missing as well, Joe Willock, Harvey Barnes. So there's all these really talented players who would make a huge difference to Newcastle who just weren't available, and yet they've still played in exactly the same way that you would expect, and that shows that Eddie Howe's way of working is the thing that makes the difference for Newcastle. So to take into consideration that against Barcelona, for example, which I think is the only game really that sort of compares to it, this is this generation's Barcelona. I've spoken to a lot of people who were there that night and who played in that game, and it was really about Tino Aspri's magic, and that Barca team was struggling at the time. I know PSG were as well, but that Barca team wasn't in great shape at the time, just having sacked Bobby Robson and replaced him with Van Gaal, having lost Ronaldo a few weeks earlier as well. And you could draw comparisons with that with PSG, given Messi and Neymar have left and everything, but Mbappe is still the best player in the world at the moment. And to come to St James's Park and put in a performance like that, and I don't even actually think he was necessarily that bad. I think actually mainly Newcastle were so good at marshalling him and did exactly what they needed to do. And the story of that game, as I say, it's about the team ethic. It's about everything that Newcastle had and Newcastle are that PSG just aren't. And that's summed up by Fabian Schär 2 years ago on the bench for that horrific day at Wolves that ended the Mike Ashley era and pretty much the Steve Bruce era as well. And then Sean Longstaff, who was completely ostracised under Bruce as well, and then Dan Burn, who's a local lad who came back as one of the first signs of the takeover. They all scored, they all played huge roles. I know Bruno Guimaraes was fantastic. I know Isak plays a huge role, and Anthony Gordon plays a huge role. These big signings have made a massive difference. Kieran Trippier as well, but the idea that this is all money has been blown out of the water by that whole thing, because they played a team that have relied on money for over a decade now and wiped the floor with them. So absolutely a brilliant performance. A few more thoughts from me because it was just such an overwhelming experience to record that video straight after at the pitch side at St James's the other day, that I just had to go on and give a few more thoughts before I got on to West Ham on Sunday. So looking ahead to that game, it's going to be really interesting to see what team is selected. Not really much more to say in terms of injury update, with Joe Linton and Callum Wilson both close, but that was the case on Tuesday. Eddie Howe didn't rule them out of PSG. Sven Botman's been ruled out again. No Willock, no Anthony Gordon, who's obviously suspended. That's a big blow. So Newcastle have got some problems to deal with at West Ham, and obviously going to a team that are in good form and going well under David Moyes. But they themselves obviously had a European game a night later and away in Freiburg in Germany. They won that game. Not going to be an easy game for Newcastle at West Ham by any stretch, but I think everybody's aware of how difficult it could be because of what West Ham are about and how they've got an identity that sort of transcends the quality of their players as well. They really play in the sort of image of David Moyes and have done for a while. So last time Newcastle went there at the end of last season, a 5-1 win, I don't think that's likely to happen. Interestingly though, because I was on the BBC Sport website today covering the live blog, bringing you all the press conferences all day, and Eddie Howe's was the first. Interestingly, the football podcast as well came out, which features Callum Wilson and Mikel Antonio, so that's a very interesting episode. And Callum Wilson was talking in terms of like he's going to be fit, and that's quite interesting. Isak as well, Alexander Isak went down with a head injury, so he's carrying a little bit of a knock, but he carried on against PSG. Whether that'll affect in terms of concussion protocols and all that sort of thing. I don't think so. That wasn't mentioned, but it's also one to watch it if it does. But I think Newcastle are generally in good shape. They've come through a really difficult spell of those 3 games, and we're just about to head into the October international break. After the September one, I was sat doing a video after the Brighton game, and it was sort of it wasn't crisis, but there was starting to be a little bit of panic about where Newcastle were going. Could they match last season? That was before the Champions League campaign really kicked up as well. There was a lot of concern about where Newcastle were going and where they were and how they were going to get on this season. They've answered every single critic and found their way to win and found their way to play. And again, I've said this before, they've evolved because they're not playing in the pressing way. They're not playing with the massive intensity from the very start. They did on Wednesday and it paid off. But generally, they're sort of growing into games and finding ways in games, and that's quite impressive and quite handy given that they can't really exert themselves in the same way that they did last season when they were training all week and planning for games with huge intensity all week. Now they're kind of having to pick and choose when they're intense and when they rest and that sort of thing. And it's quite hectic and difficult. It's hectic to cover and difficult to cover. As I say, I was 2 full days of my week were taken up at St James's Park for the press conference on Tuesday and then the match on Wednesday, and that's happened pretty much all the time for the last few weeks. So, and it's not going to stop. So that's something that Newcastle have had to get used to, but they've got used to it so perfectly. They've managed it so well, and it's helped by Sean Longstaff coming into the team, that sort of thing, and Bruno Guimaraes stepping up and Miguel Almiron finding his feet again. So many of these key players that have been fit have stood up and performed, and that's why Newcastle are still able to beat PSG and a strong PSG side as well. I mentioned on Twitter that I wasn't really impressed with Luis Enrique's choice of formation because he on Tuesday he was constantly talking about the atmosphere and how he didn't want to play into Newcastle's hands, and PSG had to manage that. And then he played a 2-man midfield and a four-man strike force, which was a bit bizarre given that they couldn't really get out of that midfield press that Newcastle had, and they outnumbered them in midfield, and that handed the game in effect to Newcastle from quite early on. West Ham will be a bit smarter than that. I think they'll have to manage the game, they'll have to manage the situation, also manage West Ham, and there's Jared Bowen's in great form at the moment, and there's Mikel Antonio, who's always a physical threat. But shout out again to Jamaal Lascelles, who probably played for the 3rd time this week, and he's come back into the frame. And I think the perception of him has completely flipped. I think there was a lot of worry that Newcastle were going to have to rely on him if Sven Botman wasn't there or Fabian Schär wasn't there, and that was a concern. How would he deal with players like Mbappe? But he was the person who managed Mbappe probably best. It was him who man-marked him in the transitions on Wednesday and did so brilliantly as well. So yeah, really tough game on Sunday against a very good West Ham side, but they'll also be tired from travelling and playing on Thursday and all the situation that everyone talks about with the Europa League and that sort of that Thursday Sunday thing is going to be difficult. So they'll be worried about what Newcastle can do as well. And I think this is a really interesting game. Can Newcastle make it another victory to go into the international break on a completely different cloud than they were last time? And as I say, after the Brighton game, it was really there was a lot of worry about where Newcastle were going to be. Were they going to fade into obscurity? Well, they've answered a lot of questions, and they've shown themselves to be quite an impressive team in more ways than just their playing style, which I think was hugely impressive last season. But they kind of needed everything to go their way, and a lot of the time it did. But they needed they needed to play start a certain way to win games. Now I think they've learned how to win differently, and I think that's going to be really, really important going forward. So yeah, really tough game at West Ham on Sunday. A lot of injury problems, particularly in attack. What will happen? I think Jacob Murphy might come in. That would be a like-for-like swap on the left for Anthony Gordon. Obviously, no Harvey Barnes as well. So there are light on options up there. If Joe Linton's fit, could he come in midfield and Elliot Anderson go on the left? That's an option. Could Joe Linton go on the left? That's another option. There's plenty of things that he can do depending on who's fit for the game. But I think Newcastle will be in confident mood. They shouldn't fear anything. I don't think it'll be 5-1 this time. I think it'll be a much tougher game. I think West Ham are in a much better place. But I think it'll be a really interesting game heading into that international break. Quick update on that, actually. I'm sure you'll have all seen yesterday. No Anthony Gordon, no Sean Longstaff, no Nick Pope and no Callum Wilson, all the players who've sort of been talked about or had England caps recently, none of them are in. Only Kieran Trippier from Newcastle's in the England squad, which I think is a huge shame, but I don't think that'll be too much of an issue for Eddie Howe, because as I mentioned, his schedule is ridiculously hectic at the moment. So thank you very much for joining me on this video. I really appreciate all the support, and particularly from last week with a lot of views and a lot of new subscribers. So thanks very much for joining me. Please continue that support, like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you on Monday for a review of this game. Cheers.